Help support AMTV by becoming a patron, an AMTV staff member, and following us over on Twitter. BBC2 has long served as one of the corporation's key assets. Ever since its launch back in 1964, it provided the Beeb with a second television channel to showcase programming that may not have necessarily made it over onto BBC One. Over the years, it evolved far more from just being a backup channel, carving out its own distinct personality and programming, so much so that it definitely holds its own alongside the older channel, not underneath it. But one major aspect of BBC2 that viewers have come to love throughout the last 60 years is the presentation. The idents that have represented the channel over the years are some of the most recognisable in television history. Some of them are groundbreakers, sequences that broke the mould and have gone on to inspire, and in some cases continue to thrive to this very day. Others, however, are undeniably some of the most bland or forgettable. The BBC2 idents from 1991 onwards, they tend to get the most attention when it comes to reviews or retrospectives. But today, we're going to be looking at the early pioneers of the channel. We'll be delving into the idents that represented BBC2 from its beginnings, all the way up until that fateful rebrand in early 1991. Let's get started with the very first ident that appeared on the channel back in 1964.
This was BBC2.
Making the best with what you've got, right? Okay, along with a lot of these early idents, we have to strongly keep in mind that these were made during the 1960s. Whilst presentation had been gradually developing and becoming a little more complex than just being a caption card or holding slide, most 60s idents for any TV channel are still incredibly simple by today's standards. BBC One at the time were already establishing the globe as its central symbol, one that it would continue to utilise in some form right into the early years of the 21st century. For BBC Two, however, no such symbol would be incorporated. Instead, we see two stripes appear from both sides of the screen, with the numeral 2 and the BBC corporate logo shooting in from the top and bottom. It's simple, for sure, but I like how all four sides of the screen have been used, certainly attempting to maximise what could have been done with the available technology back in 1964. In terms of music, we get a trumpet fanfare, which itself is based on the Morse code translation of the word BBC2. A very neat little inclusion there, if you ask me. Honestly, this one I think makes the best with what it has. I perhaps would have swapped the black and white tones around, with the overall background being more black than white. But in terms of a launch ident, it gets the job done, especially after BBC2's botched launch, where due to a major power failure, everyone on board was scrambling to just keep the channel on air. We've gone more in depth on that incident in the past, and you can click the card above to check out that video. I do wonder what this ident would have looked like in colour, but don't worry, we're moving away from the world of monochrome for our next sequence today, which first made its debut on BBC Two in 1967. Ah, the wonderful world of colour. Colour television was like the holy grail for broadcasters in the mid to late 60s, and during the summer of 1967, the BBC made the iconic achievement, being amongst the first in Europe to do so. BBC Two was the channel to receive colour first, presumably to help iron out any bugs or errors before colour would eventually come to BBC One. To usher in the colour era, a brand new ident was devised. We see the three main colours of television, red, blue and green, all come together to form one singular white dot. Before long, an animated blue 2 is drawn out, before it begins to rotate, showing different coloured 2s as if they were faces on a cube. This cube ident, as it became known, is iconic for being one of the first colour television idents to be shown in Europe, never mind the UK, and whilst it is very striking and engaging to look at, I can't help but feel that it isn't perfect. For starters, on all the surviving clips we have anyway, there is no music whatsoever, and for 1960s idents, a lot of them didn't have music. But I feel for a sequence that is here to promote colour television, perhaps some kind of tune or fanfare would have been played, at least while the numeral tune was being formed. Also, whilst the colours we see are indeed eye-catching, the vast black background does make this ident feel a little empty to some degree. I get that this was the early days of colour TV in the UK, but had the whole picture been swathed in colour and they all complemented one another, that could have been a visually distinct piece for sure, especially for the 1960s. The cube format would last for several years on BBC2, with some minor alterations coming further down the line. As BBC One moved to colour in late 1969, supposedly an alteration occurred to the cube too, keeping the numeral in just one colour, and a line being added between the cube and the word colour itself. I can't find any clips of this particular variant, but in 1972, when the colour on BBC One went italicised, BBC Two seemingly followed suit. So, let's take a look at that. Bit of a step back if you ask me. We can see that the overall structure has remained the same, the two numerals still spinning showing off its cube faces, but instead of a variety of colours, we just get one, a bright blue tone. I wouldn't mind this so much, but the feature of the word colour as part of the ident makes this a little irritable. Why bother promoting that you run a colour service when your station identifier is only showing one colour? Especially compared to the 1967 variant, which showed multiple colours. I suppose the colour moniker now makes everything look more in line with how BBC One was presented at the time, but I definitely prefer the earlier sequence. There were different variations of the new version, mainly with different coloured backgrounds, but after just 2 years, a brand new ident was brought in to replace the rotating cube entirely. So we'll jump now to late 1974 and take a look at what they came up with. A very interesting design. This new ident came at a time of change for the BBC's television channels, as BBC One underwent a similar upgrade, debuting the famous blue and yellow mirrored globe, one that it would use for the next 7 years. For BBC Two, however, a sense of distinction still remained. Against a blue background, we see several discs slide in from both sides of the screen, alternating in light blue and white tones. Eventually, when they settle in the centre of the screen, we can see the numeral 2 has been formed. The alternating colours work surprisingly well against the background, and despite looking a bit primitive today, I kinda like the digital-esque feel I get from this one. The 23 discs that rotate inwards and outwards were actually part of a mechanical model, on a similar basis to the preceding cube and for the mirrored globes on BBC One. I do have my criticisms though. There's no music once again, which gave the sequence a very eerie feeling as a whole, and whilst the blue background does work against the many lines flying in, I do feel a better colour could have been selected for the background. Now, I love the colour blue, it's my favourite colour, but this is one instance where a black background would have arguably worked better. There is a small clip where BBC Two did use a black background, seemingly briefly. I think this just makes the 2 numeral a lot more punchy and standout, especially considering how big it is. There were other small variations too, like the 2 sliding out and a map of the UK sliding in, and supposedly a version with a yellow background and black lines replacing the white, though I've been unable to track this one down. But after 5 years of this rather interesting look, BBC Two would undergo a revamp once again, and this time it would find itself at the very forefront of some groundbreaking new technology. Yeah, I don't really like this one. I know that may be a hot take in some cases, as this is arguably one of the most beloved idents from the channel, but there's just something about it that just doesn't click with me. But before we get into my criticisms, let's talk about how it was formed. The 1979 ident is the first instance of a computer-generated sequence being played on television, anywhere in the world as far as I understand. This was cutting-edge stuff, with the sequence being drawn out by the computer each and every time it was played, rather than relying on mechanical props like in the past. The double stripe 2 had been used on the channel for some time before the debut of the ident, used on things such as caption cards. We see the 2 orange lines appear from the left of the screen, drawn before the double stripe 2 appears, and then some more orange lines, and that's about it. We hear a little fanfare play, the first time any sort of music had been used for around 15 years, but by God does it rub me the wrong way. It's that very early synth sound that either sounds great or ages like sour milk, and sadly for me, this is definitely the latter. The sounds just don't blend nicely, it all feels clunky, kinda like the sequence as a whole. I completely respect that this was at the forefront of new technology, so keeping things relatively simple is understandable, but with such a thin logo against a vast black background, like with the initial cube design, the screen is just left feeling empty. Despite my misgivings, this ident stuck around for nearly 7 years. Then, in 1986, it was time for change once again. BBC One had recently debuted its rather classy and impressive computer-originated world, so how would BBC Two follow in its older siblings' footsteps? Let's find out. Okay, this is worse. Honestly, I'm not sure what the thinking was behind this, but this is blandness personified. It had been said that the higher-ups at the Beeb wanted BBC2 to showcase more highbrow programming, thus wanting presentation to reflect that. But if highbrow translates to boring, well, you definitely succeeded. Against a harsh white background, we see the word 2 spelt out, the first time a numeral wasn't used in the channel's history. The font design is likened to stencils, and it does give a subtle 3D impression. There is thankfully some splashes of colour here, namely red, blue and green, a nice little throwback to the original Cube sequence, and once again the 3 primary colours used in television. Some have said it's also a nice reference to 3 parts of the United Kingdom, with red being associated with Wales, green for Northern Ireland, and blue for Scotland. Whilst these colour touches are nice, they don't salvage the overwhelming sense of dullness that permeates through the ident. Where the BBC One computer-originated world succeeded in an attempt to be impressive and classy, this one fails disastrously. You know the situation isn't good when the special Christmas variants are far more interesting than the base product. Somehow, this ident lasted on BBC2 for nearly 5 years, before new controller Alan Yentob decided that a rebrand for both BBC 1 and 2 was necessary. More so for the latter. Here's some of his own words to give you an idea.
I realised there was a problem almost as soon as I took over the channel. It was obvious that the logo made absolutely no impact. In fact, it was something anyone could have told you. It was singularly unmemorable, and it told you nothing about the personality of the channel.
Alas, when the rebrand did hit BBC2 in 1991, it would change the channel's fortunes forever, and go on to create one of the longest running and most well-loved television idents of all time. We've covered the 1991 to 2001 set of BBC2 idents extensively on the channel, marathoning them all on the Ident Review Extra, so go and check out that series if you want to learn more about those. BBC2's first few decades on the air are fascinating to look back on. In terms of programming, it was often home to the experimental and unique, and for its presentation, it sometimes reflected that ethos too. From its earliest days, making best with the technology and resources available, it always aimed to give itself a unique identity. A sense of self, one that still tied in with the BBC as a whole, but one that was able to stand on its own 2 feet. It often would find itself at the forefront of major new developments. The launch of colour television, the introduction of computer-generated technology, BBC2 was always there to step up to the plate. Not every sequence worked perfectly, a lot of trial and error and mixed results, but by the dawn of the 1990s, it seems that those running the channel had realised its unique place among the schedules, and were able to give us a set of idents that truly represented, and showed off, just what BBC2 was all about. Thank you so much for watching this episode of the Ident Review. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and drop your thoughts on the sequences today in the comments down below. I've been Martyn from AMTV. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you next time. Thank you to our patrons for helping to support the show, and a special thank you to Macra, Hooks Media, Ben Freeman, Ethan Carberry-Holt, Bruce Danton, Globe of Reviews, Derek Chambers, Sean Knock, Dord Khan, Traffy, Liam Domain, and Keith Myers, our AMTV staff members.